In the misty outskirts of a quiet American town lies a house that most locals won't even talk about anymore. It sits alone, condemned, barely standing with faded paint peeling off its wooden frame, its windows shattered and covered in grime. Overgrown weeds and gnarled trees choke the front yard, their roots coiling like ropes around the foundation. People say the house is cursed, that it eats up anyone foolish enough to step inside. But it's been years since anyone dared to try. That's why nobody was around to warn Carl Thompson, a hefty real estate agent who prided himself on not believing in local legends. Carl had made a career out of selling properties people thought couldn't be sold. "There's no such thing as a lost cause," he liked to say. One stormy afternoon, Carl got a call from a prospective client, a woman named Deborah. She and her husband, Larry, were interested in flipping a house, and they were willing to look at even the toughest listings. Carl immediately thought of that house on the outskirts of town. He figured they might be intrigued by its dark history, and the price tag was tempting. Carl had never actually been inside, but it was just a building. Nothing to fear. So, they set off, Carl in his old Cadillac, followed closely by Deborah and Larry in their pickup. Rain poured down as they turned off the main road onto the cracked, winding path that led to the house. But as they neared their destination, Carl's car sputtered and jerked. His engine died, headlights dimming as the storm swallowed the light around them. Larry and Deborah pulled over behind him, watching as Carl struggled with his hood. Eventually, they got out to help, their umbrellas barely shielding them from the heavy rain. The storm was relentless, and after nearly an hour of trying to restart the engine, it was clear they'd have to seek shelter until the rain let up. The only shelter was the house. Carl hesitated, glancing at the dilapidated structure in the distance. A cold, gnawing unease crept over him, but he forced a grin, waving the couple forward. "Nothing to worry about, folks. It's just an old house." Together, they made their way up the gravel path, the mud squelching beneath their feet. As they approached, they noticed something strange. Despite the shattered windows, they couldn't see anything inside. Just darkness, thick and impenetrable, like the house was hiding something. The front door was slightly ajar. Carl pushed it open with a creak, revealing an entryway that seemed untouched by time. Old wallpaper peeled from the walls, and furniture sat covered in sheets. But a thick layer of dust coated everything, disturbed only by the occasional faint footprint leading deeper into the house. They stepped inside, each of them holding their breath. The air was dense, stale, with a faint smell of rot that clung to the back of their throats. As they moved further, Deborah swore she could hear something faint, like a distant whisper, just on the edge of hearing. "Just the wind," Carl said, trying to calm her and himself. They made their way to the living room. The layout was strange, as if walls had shifted over the years, narrowing corridors and leaving dark, dead-end spaces. They paused in the center of the room, waiting for the rain to ease up, when the door slammed shut behind them. Carl laughed nervously, trying to play it off. "Just the wind again, right?" But his voice wavered. He turned to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Though it felt strangely warm under his fingers, pulsing like something alive. Just then, they heard a faint shuffling above them. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the ceiling. Larry gulped, his wide eyes darting upward. "Is someone living here?" "No one's lived here for decades," Carl whispered, though he didn't sound sure anymore. He glanced around, spotting a narrow staircase leading up to the second floor. "I'll just check it out. Be right back." Carl moved up the stairs, every step groaning under his weight. The footsteps above him stopped, and silence pressed in on him. As he reached the top, he found himself staring down a narrow hallway lined with doors, each one closed tight. There was no sign of anyone. Just as he turned to head back down, one of the doors creaked open on its own. Carl froze, his heart pounding as he peered into the dark room. Inside, he saw a mirror leaning against the wall, a crack running down its center. His reflection was strange. Distorted, like something was wrong with his face. It was his eyes. They were dark, hollow. And then, they blinked. A cold chill ran through Carl as he staggered back. He rushed down the stairs, but when he reached the bottom, Deborah and Larry were gone. "Deborah?" "Larry," he called, his voice echoing. The only answer was a faint whisper, drifting from deeper within the house, calling his name. "Carl. Carl." He turned, following the voice down a dark hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Shadows closed in around him, and the air grew thick and damp. Just as he thought he'd reached the end, he came upon Deborah and Larry standing stock-still in a small, windowless room. Their backs were to him, and neither of them moved. Relief washed over him. "There you two are. Let's get out of here. This place isn't worth it." But they didn't respond. He reached out to touch Deborah's shoulder, but as his fingers brushed her, her head turned slowly. Far too slowly. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her skin as pale as wax. Carl stumbled back, bumping into Larry, who turned just as slowly. Larry's face was blank, his eyes dark, lifeless. Their bodies were stiff, like they were frozen in place, trapped by some unseen force. Carl tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The air felt thick, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He staggered back, finding himself alone in a narrow, dark hallway with no end. The house seemed to close in around him, twisting and reshaping as he stumbled forward. He couldn't remember where he was anymore. Every room looked the same. Finally, he found himself in front of a cracked mirror. His reflection stared back at him, its eyes dark, hollow, dead. And slowly, his reflection began to smile. The last thing Carl saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was his own twisted smile looking back from the mirror. The house sits there still, condemned, yet untouched, waiting. Locals say they can still hear heavy footsteps inside on stormy nights. But no one dares to go near. And if you look closely in the windows, you might just catch a glimpse of Carl, trapped forever, staring out from the darkness within.